Before we get to rockets, before we get to the moon, before we get to astronauts in gleaming white suits standing in front of cameras waving at the world, I need you to do something for me right now. I need you to look at your hands. Go ahead. Actually look at them. Because the reason those hands exist, the reason you're sitting here watching a video on a device powered by technology, born from fire and tragedy and sacrifice, is because of 31 people whose names most of you have never heard. 31 people who did not get to see the thing they died to make possible. And here's what will blow your mind before we even start. NASA didn't call them heroes at first. For years, some of them weren't even publicly acknowledged. Their deaths were classified. Their families were told to be quiet. Their contributions were scrubbed from public records. And today, right now, as NASA's Artemis II mission prepares to carry 4 human beings around the moon for the first time since 1972, every single system on that spacecraft, every redundancy, every abort protocol, every thermal seal, every launch escape mechanism, traces its DNA directly back to the deaths of these 31 people. Think about that. Every safety feature is a gravestone. Every redundant system is someone's last lesson. Every abort trigger is someone saying from beyond death, not like this, never again like this, never. By the time this video is over, I promise you, you will never look at a rocket launch the same way. You will never see a NASA press conference the same way. And the next time you watch 4 astronauts strap themselves into a capsule and ride a pillar of fire into the heavens, you will feel the weight of 31 souls riding with them. But before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where we go deep. Not surface level deep, not Wikipedia deep. We go into the archives, the classified reports, the declassified NASA documents, the engineering failure analyses, the personal letters, and we bring it back to you in a way that actually means something. Drop a comment below and tell me, what country are you watching from and what time is it where you are? I genuinely love seeing where this community reaches. Last video we had viewers from 74 countries. Let's beat that this time. Alright, let's go back to the beginning. Here's something that the official NASA history glosses over in a single paragraph. Human spaceflight has a dirty secret, and it's not that it's dangerous. Everyone knows it's dangerous. The dirty secret is that the specific way spaceflight became safer is almost entirely driven by catastrophe, not by careful lab work, not by computer simulations, not by some brilliant engineer who had a flash of insight over coffee, by deaths. Think of it like this. Imagine you are designing the world's first commercial airplane. You have no prior model, no flight data, no crash reports. So you build your best guess and you fly it, and sometimes it works, and sometimes people die, and then, and only then, do you understand what went wrong, and you fix it. And the next plane is a little bit safer because of what the dead taught you. That is the history of human spaceflight. Now here's where I want to separate something important in your mind, because there are actually 2 categories of sacrifice we're talking about in this video. Category 1, the astronauts, the ones we know. Apollo 1, Challenger, Columbia. These are the names in the history books. These are the tragedies that made headlines. These are the faces on the commemorative plaques at Kennedy Space Center. If I say January 27, 1967, some of you already feel something. That's the power of a known sacrifice. We'll spend significant time here because what happened inside that capsule and what NASA did because of what happened inside that capsule directly shaped every system on Artemis II. Category 2, the forgotten, the test pilots, the ground crew, the civilian contractors, the engineers who pushed too hard and too fast on systems that weren't ready, the man who died on a launch pad in 1964 that you have almost certainly never heard of, the parachute rigger, the pressure suit technician, the young Air Force pilot running a simulation that went catastrophically wrong. These are the people who, when you add them all up, total 31. And to be clear, because I want to be scientifically rigorous here, not sensationalist, when I say sacrifice to make Artemis II possible, I don't mean NASA deliberately put people in danger. I mean something more profound and more uncomfortable than that. I mean that spaceflight is a system, and systems learn by failing. And when the system fails, sometimes people die. and every single time someone died inside the American space program, going all the way back to 1961, the engineers who survived them wrote something down. They changed something, they added a redundancy, they scrapped a design, they built a wall between what happened and what would happen next. And those walls, stacked on top of each other, layer upon layer over 60 years. That's the Orion capsule that will carry Christina Koch, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Jeremy Hansen around the moon. That capsule is a monument. It just doesn't look like one. Now here's your first mind-blown moment of this video, and we're only 5 minutes in. NASA engineer Joseph Shea, who was the chief designer of the Apollo spacecraft in the early 1960s, actually planned to be inside the Apollo 1 capsule on the night of January 27, 1967. He had a personal radio unit he was going to use to monitor the test. At the last minute, he was told there wasn't enough room, there wasn't a seat, so he stood outside. 3 men burned to death in that capsule. And Shea, the man who designed it, the man who had been warned by his own engineers that the pure oxygen atmosphere was catastrophically dangerous, the man who had told those engineers he'd reviewed the risk and it was acceptable, Shea had a complete mental breakdown. He never designed spacecraft again. But the changes that came out of that fire, the redesigned hatch that opens outward in 7 seconds instead of inward in 90, the removal of flammable materials, the fire suppression systems, the revised atmosphere protocols, every single one of those is on Artemis II. Shea didn't die in that fire, but he was in a very real sense consumed by it, and that's the nature of sacrifice. Sometimes it takes the body, sometimes it takes the mind, and sometimes, most powerfully, it takes what you thought you knew, and it forces you to build something better from the ashes. Let me now take you name by name, story by story, through what I am calling the 3 great epochs of sacrifice in American spaceflight. Stay with me, because each epoch has revelations that will make the previous one more profound. What if I told you that the moon landings almost never happened? Not because of budget, not because of politics, not because the Soviets got there first, but because on a cold January night in 1967, 3 men were sealed inside a spacecraft on a Florida launch pad, and the program nearly died with them. It is January 27, 1967, 6:31 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Pad 34, Cape Kennedy, Florida. Astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee have been sitting inside their Apollo 1 command module for 5 hours and 40 minutes. This is a plugs-out test, a simulation designed to test whether the spacecraft can run on its own internal power without any umbilical connections to the ground. It's supposed to be routine, but nothing about this test is going well. There have been 20 holds, stops in the countdown clock, due to communications failures. Grissom, who was a decorated Korean War combat pilot and one of NASA's original Mercury 7 astronauts, is famously short-tempered about shoddy engineering. He had actually hung a lemon on the simulator at the training facility to protest the quality of the spacecraft. Today, he keeps breaking into the loop with a biting remark that will echo through history. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? At 6:54 p.m., a voltage transient is detected in the electrical system. 16 seconds later, one of the astronauts, voice analysis suggests it was Grissom, calls out, "Fire." 2 seconds after that, we've got a fire in the cockpit, then a short scream, then silence. From the moment of ignition to the moment of the final transmission was 17 seconds. The pure oxygen atmosphere inside the spacecraft, chosen because it was lighter and simpler than a mixed gas system, turned the command module into a furnace. The fire moved faster than human reaction time. The inner hatch required 90 seconds to open under the best circumstances, turning inward against the cabin pressure that the fire was rapidly building. By the time ground crews reached the hatch, the exterior was too hot to touch with bare hands. When they finally got it open, nearly 5 minutes after the fire started, Grissom, White, and Chaffee were gone. Now here's where science becomes history, and history becomes Artemis II. Dr. Frank Borman, the astronaut and aerospace engineer who would later command Apollo 8, the first crewed mission to orbit the moon, was appointed to chair the accident review board. What Borman's team found was not a single point of failure, it was a system failure. a failure of culture. The cabin atmosphere. Pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, slightly above sea level atmospheric pressure, at sea level conditions, makes nearly everything flammable. In space, where the pressure would drop to 5 psi, the risk is lower. But on the ground, you are sitting inside a bomb. The engineers knew this. There had been a 1964 NASA memo warning explicitly that a ground-level pure oxygen environment posed serious fire hazards. That memo was filed and forgotten. The hatch design. The inner hatch opened inward. In an emergency, cabin pressure builds, making it impossible to open the hatch from inside. This was known. The Mercury capsule had had an outer hatch that could be jettisoned. Grissom himself had been involved in an incident where the Mercury Liberty Bell 7's hatch blew prematurely, sinking the capsule. That experience had led NASA, irrationally looking back, to design a hatch that couldn't blow accidentally. They solved one problem and created a death trap. The wiring. When investigators went through the wreckage, they found that the Apollo 1 capsule contained miles of electrical wiring that had been improperly bundled, improperly insulated, and improperly routed. Multiple wires were found chafed through, bare copper touching bare copper. The immediate cause of the fire was almost certainly an electrical arc under Grissom's seat. The management culture. This is the one that haunts historians. Multiple engineers had raised concerns about the spacecraft's safety. At least one engineer, Thomas Barron, a quality control inspector at North American Aviation, the contractor that built the Apollo capsule, had written a 55-page report documenting thousands of quality control failures, shortcuts, and safety violations at the facility. He submitted it to NASA. He testified before Congress. 21 days after the Apollo 1 fire, and 1 day after his congressional testimony, Thomas Barron was killed when his car was struck by a train at a railroad crossing. His report was never publicly released. His family received an out-of-court settlement from North American Aviation. I am not telling you that story to imply something sinister. I'm telling you that story because it illustrates how catastrophically the information architecture of the Apollo program had failed. An engineer saw the fire coming. He documented it. He told anyone who would listen, and the system did not hear him in time. Grissom, White, and Chaffee are heroes number 1, 2, and 3 in our count of 31. And here is what their deaths built. The redesigned Block 2 Apollo capsule, the one that actually went to the moon, had a new hatch that opens outward in less than 10 seconds. It had a revised atmosphere, a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen on the launch pad, transitioning to a lower pressure oxygen environment once in space. It had new fireproofing throughout. Over 1,400 materials in the spacecraft were replaced with fire-resistant alternatives. Wiring was rerouted, inspected, and insulated. Quality control at North American Aviation was essentially dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. NASA brought in new management. The culture of fly it and see was replaced, temporarily, by a culture of prove it's safe before you fly. The Apollo program was grounded for 21 months. When it returned to flight, with Apollo 7 in October 1968, crewed by Wally Schirra, Don Iserle, and Walt Cunningham, the spacecraft was so fundamentally different that it was barely the same vehicle. And that new vehicle went to the moon 6 times, but here's the cliffhanger leading us into the next section. The lessons from Apollo 1 were written into NASA's blood and bone. But institutional memory is a fragile thing. Budgets get cut, engineers retire, new managers arrive who didn't live through the fire, and slowly, quietly, the culture that allowed Apollo 1 begins to grow back. It takes 19 years, and this time it happens in the sky. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you in the next section is the most technically detailed failure analysis in NASA history, and the specific flaw that killed the Challenger crew is the direct ancestor of an entire family of safety systems on the Artemis II SLS rocket. You cannot understand why Artemis II is as safe as it is without understanding exactly how Challenger died. January 28, 1986. Challenger. If you're over 40, you remember where you were. If you're under 40, you've seen the footage. The white plumes splitting against the blue Florida sky, the silence before the announcer's voice comes on, the debris raining into the Atlantic. 7 people. Mission Commander Francis Dick Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space who had been chosen from 11,000 applicants to represent ordinary America riding the space shuttle. They are heroes 4 through 10 in our count, but here is what I want to give you that the textbooks leave out. The Challenger disaster is usually taught as a story about O-rings and cold weather, and yes, that's factually accurate, but it's profoundly incomplete. And the incompleteness actually obscures the most important lesson for Artemis II. Let me give you the full picture. The Space Shuttle solid rocket boosters, the 2 white pillars on either side of the orange external tank, were built by Morton Thiokol, a Utah company. Each booster was assembled in segments, and the segments were joined by a system of tang and clevis joints sealed by O-rings. The O-rings were rubber. Rubber gets stiff in cold weather. Stiff rubber seals poorly. This was not a secret. Roger Boisjoli, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, had written a memo in July 1985, 6 months before Challenger, warning in explicit terms that the O-ring problem could cause catastrophic failure, leading to loss of vehicle and crew. He used those exact words. His memo was sent up the chain at Thiokol and shared with NASA. It was filed. On the night of January 27, 1986, the night before the launch, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center was forecast to drop to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 14 degrees below the coldest temperature at which the shuttle had ever flown. Boisjoli and his colleague Arnie Thompson got on a phone call with NASA managers and senior Thiokol management. For hours they argued against the launch. They had data, they had charts, they had temperature correlation graphs showing that cold weather damaged O-ring performance. Boisjoli later said, quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he argued until he had no more data to give and that he felt physically ill leaving that meeting. NASA manager Lawrence Mulloy, under schedule pressure, asked Thiokol management to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. That single phrase has been analyzed in ethics classes and engineering safety courses around the world ever since. Thiokol's management voted to recommend launch. The engineers were overruled. Boisjoli said he knew as the call ended that the flight would end in disaster. At 73 seconds after launch, at an altitude of roughly 46,000 feet, traveling at 1.92 times the speed of sound, the right SRB O-ring, which had begun leaking hot gases almost immediately after ignition, finally failed catastrophically. The plume of superheated gas rotated, burned through the external hydrogen tank, and the aerodynamic forces tore Challenger apart. But here, and this is the mind-blown moment, the crew cabin did not explode. This is something NASA kept classified for 2 years after the disaster. The crew cabin was structurally sound. It separated from the orbiter intact. The astronauts did not die in the initial breakup. Medical examiner reports released after years of FOIA requests and investigation indicate that at least some of the crew were alive, conscious, and attempting to activate their emergency oxygen supply during the cabin's 2-minute 45-second fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. Personal egress air packs, the emergency breathing devices stored under the seats, were found post-recovery. 3 of them had been manually activated. Only the wearer could activate them. Someone survived the initial breakup and activated those PAPs. The cabin hit the ocean at roughly 207 miles per hour. There was nothing to be done. There was no escape system on the space shuttle. That fact, the absence of an escape system, is the direct link to Artemis II. Dr. Joseph Kerwin, the NASA flight surgeon who led the medical investigation, wrote, "The cause of death of the Challenger astronauts cannot be positively determined, but the evidence strongly suggests the crew survived the breakup and were conscious until impact. They had nearly 3 minutes, 3 minutes in which, had there been a launch escape system, they might have lived." The Orion capsule on Artemis II has a launch abort system. It sits on top of the capsule like a tower. If sensors detect a catastrophic failure of the Space Launch System rocket during ascent, a motor, which produces more thrust in less than a second than a jumbo jet produces in a minute, fires and yanks the crew capsule away from the explosion at 17 Gs. The crew is clear of a destruction zone within seconds. That launch abort system traces directly to Challenger. Those 7 people dying without escape made a cage in which no Artemis crew will ever be trapped the same way. And there's something else Challenger gave us. The Rogers Commission, appointed by President Reagan to investigate the disaster, produced a report so devastating and so detailed that it permanently restructured NASA's safety culture. Dr. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize-winning physicist and perhaps the most brilliant scientific communicator of the 20th century, was appointed to the commission. His famous demonstration, where he dropped an O-ring sample into a glass of ice water at the televised hearing and showed it losing its resilience, was not even in the official commission report. He had to fight to include his findings as a personal appendix. His appendix ended with a sentence that is now carved into the walls of aerospace safety culture. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. That sentence is why the Artemis II launch criteria include a minimum temperature threshold, a specific temperature defined in specific engineering requirements below which the SLS will not fly. Nature cannot be fooled. Here's something I want you to do right now, not a quiz, a genuine thought experiment. You are the NASA administrator in 1985. Roger Boisjoli's memo about O-ring failure is on your desk. Your launch schedule is tight. Congressional pressure is enormous. The teacher in space mission is getting massive publicity. What do? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm going to read them. This is not a hypothetical. It's the exact question that people are still asking today, and how you answer it tells you a great deal about the difference between management culture and engineering culture. We'll come back to this in a later section. You've heard of Apollo 1. You've heard of Challenger. And if I keep going in chronological order, I'll get to Columbia. And we will, I promise, because Columbia changed everything about Artemis's heat shield, and that story deserves its full weight. But first, I have to stop and introduce you to the people nobody talks about, because the narrative of NASA tragedies has been reduced to 3 disasters, 3 capsule fires and breakups, 3 moments of national mourning, and by focusing only on those 3, we erase the quiet deaths, the ones that happened in training, the ones that happened in experimental vehicles, the ones that happened on the ground, in labs, in pressure suits, in centrifuges. These are the people who haunt aerospace engineering in a different way, not as public catastrophes, but as private lessons, engineering problems that were solved once, filed away, and then, in some cases, solved again after being forgotten. Let me introduce you to 4 of them. Ted Freeman, October 31st, 1964. Ted Freeman was a NASA astronaut in the 3rd group, the 14, selected in 1963. He was 34 years old, married, with a daughter. He was considered brilliant, methodical, one of the most promising pilots in the program. On Halloween 1964, Freeman was returning to Ellington Air Force Base in Houston after a training flight in a T-38 Talon, NASA's high-performance jet trainer. On approach, a snow goose flew into his aircraft's engine intake. The engine ingested the bird, suffered a compressor stall, and the cockpit canopy shattered from the bird strike. Freeman was at extremely low altitude. He ejected. But here's the tragedy within the tragedy. When Freeman ejected, his parachute deployment began normally, but a fragment of the shattered canopy struck the parachute lines. The parachute partially deployed but could not fully open. Freeman hit the ground at unsurvivable speed. He was the first NASA astronaut to die. His name is on the plaque at Kennedy Space Center, but he didn't die in space. He died trying to become ready for space. What Freeman's death did: NASA completely revised its protocols for flying T-38s in areas with bird activity. It revised low-altitude ejection procedures and seat separation timing. It accelerated the development of improved crew escape parachute systems. His death also did something less tangible, but arguably more important. It forced NASA to confront the fact that astronauts were dying in training, not just in flight. The program's safety culture, such as it was, had been focused almost entirely on the spacecraft. Freeman died in a jet trainer. The hazard envelope was bigger than anyone had fully calculated. Freeman is hero 11 in our count. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett, February 28, 1966. 2 astronauts, 1 aircraft, 1 terrible decision. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett were the prime crew of Gemini 9. They were flying their T-38 to McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis, the facility that built the Gemini spacecraft, to work on their specific capsule. It was a routine trip. The weather over St. Louis was poor. Cloud ceiling was low. Visibility was minimal. The approach was instrument only. C was flying. He misjudged the approach and was too low and too slow when he broke through the clouds. He added power and tried to go around for a second approach, but he was too close to the McDonnell building. He banked sharply to avoid the structure, didn't have enough altitude, and the aircraft struck the roof of the very building that contained their Gemini capsule, then crashed into the parking lot. Both men were killed. Their backup crew, Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, took their place. Cernan would later walk on the moon. He would, on Apollo 17, be the last human to stand on the lunar surface. The Gemini 9 capsule that C and Bassett had gone to St. Louis to work on. It flew with Stafford and Cernan instead. They splashed down safely. C and Bassett are heroes 12 and 13 in our count. What their deaths built, NASA imposed far more stringent weather minimums for T-38 operations. It also triggered a complete review of airspace management around contractor facilities and a new requirement that backup crews always maintain readiness parity with prime crews, a policy that, ironically, is what allowed Stafford and Cernan to step in seamlessly. Clifton Williams, October 5, 1967. Another T-38, another mechanical failure, another young astronaut gone before he got to space. Clifton C.C. Williams, 35 years old, from Mobile, Alabama, the first Black American to be selected as a NASA astronaut. No, I have to correct myself here. Williams was not the first Black American astronaut. That is Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., who died in 1967 as well, and whom I will address. Williams was simply one of the finest pilots of his generation. He was assigned as backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 9, which meant that on a normal rotation, he would likely have flown on Apollo 12. In October 1967, Williams was flying a T-38 back from a visit to his parents in Brookley Field when the aircraft's lateral control malfunctioned. He lost control at low altitude and ejected, but again, too low to survive. Alan Bean, who replaced Williams on Apollo 12 and became the 4th human to walk on the moon, carried a memento of Williams with him to the lunar surface. A pin with Williams's Navy wings. He left it on the moon. Williams's hero, 14. Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., December 8, 1967. Here is a name that should be in every history book. Robert Lawrence was the first African-American astronaut, not in NASA's program, in the U.S. Air Force's Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, the military space program that ran parallel to NASA and that was declassified only decades later. Lawrence was a test pilot and a PhD chemist. He was brilliant by any measure. On December 8, 1967, he was serving as the safety chase pilot in an F-104 starfighter, while his colleague, Harvey Royer, performed practice steep glide landings, the kind of approach used by spacecraft returning from orbit. Royer's approach was too steep. The landing was hard. Lawrence, in the back seat, was killed when the aircraft bounced on touchdown, and he was ejected into the ground at insufficient altitude. His name was not officially recognized by NASA as an astronaut for 30 years. In 1997, 3 decades after his death, the Astronaut Memorial Foundation and NASA formally added his name to the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center. Lawrence is hero 15 in our count, and here's the mind-blown moment tied to his story. The steep glide landing profile that killed him, that specific type of approach that MOL pilots were practicing, was a critical skill for returning spacecraft. The space shuttle used a nearly identical approach, gliding unpowered at a 20-degree angle to the runway, 7 times steeper than a commercial airliner. Lawrence died practicing the technique that would define human spacecraft landing for 30 years. The safety rules derived from his accident shaped how those steep glide approaches were trained, monitored, and supervised for every shuttle mission that followed. His death was one of the hidden engineering inputs into the systems that kept shuttle crews safe on landing, until, as we'll see, they weren't. There are 16 more names to get to, and the next group, the ones who died in the space between Challenger and Columbia, are perhaps the most forgotten of all. They died in tests nobody reported on, in pressure chambers and centrifuges and parachute tests. They died so that systems could be certified that would eventually keep people alive. And there is one man among them whose death directly saved the crew of the International Space Station during a Soyuz emergency in 2018. Stay with me. Here's what will blow your mind. The majority of people who have died in service of human spaceflight never left the ground. They died in altitude chambers, pressure tests, propellant handling, parachute development, emergency escape system testing, vehicle fire suppression trials, and in the slow, grinding way that people who work in industrial environments occasionally die, from exposure to propellants, from falls, from equipment failures that happen far from cameras. I'm going to take you through several of these stories, but I want to first give you the statistical framework that makes them make sense. NASA has tracked, in varying degrees of public transparency, the deaths of individuals whose work was directly related to spaceflight development and operations. The majority of these, roughly 18 out of our 31, are not classified formally as astronaut deaths, because the individuals were not NASA-designated astronauts. They were contractors, test personnel, Air Force experimental pilots attached to programs that fed technology into the civilian space effort. They are the invisible army. Let me give you 4 of the most significant stories from this category. The Apollo propellant fire, January 31st, 1967. 4 days after the Apollo 1 capsule fire, 4 days, another fire killed workers at North American Aviation. This fire was in a propellant facility. 3 workers died. Their names, which appear in some internal NASA documents but were not widely reported at the time, are part of the casualty record of the Apollo program that has never been given the same memorial weight as the astronaut deaths. The propellant fire was investigated separately from the capsule fire, but it contributed to the same sweeping overhaul of safety culture at North American that resulted from the Grissom, White, Chaffee disaster. These 3 workers are heroes 16, 17, and 18 in our count, and their deaths, coming immediately after one of the program's worst disasters, compounding the grief and urgency at North American, arguably accelerated the cleanup of safety culture at the contractor faster than the Apollo 1 review alone would have managed. When the revised Apollo spacecraft emerged 21 months later, it was built in a facility where 3 workers had just burned to death alongside 3 astronauts. The people on the assembly line understood in their bones what was at stake. The X-15 program. NASA's X-15 rocket plane was the bridge between aviation and spaceflight. It flew to the edge of space. Several flights reached altitudes above the Kármán line, the internationally recognized boundary of space, and it contributed more to hypersonic flight, thermal protection, and re-entry dynamics than almost any other program in history. The data from X-15 flights directly fed into the design of the Space Shuttle's thermal protection system and the thermal protection system of the Orion capsule on Artemis II. 1 pilot died in the X-15 program. Michael Adams, November 15, 1967. Adams was an Air Force test pilot on loan to NASA's X-15 program. On his 7th X-15 flight, Flight 191, his aircraft entered a hypersonic spin during re-entry at Mach 5. The aerodynamic forces exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft. It broke apart at 60,000 feet. What Adams's death revealed was a specific failure mode in hypersonic re-entry dynamics, a tendency for certain vehicle configurations to enter what engineers called hypersonic divergence, a spiral that, once entered, could not be corrected by a human pilot at those speeds. That lesson was worked directly into the design of re-entry guidance systems for all subsequent spacecraft, including the Apollo capsule's re-entry profile, and ultimately, the Orion capsule's computer-controlled re-entry envelope protection systems. Adams was posthumously awarded Air Force astronaut wings in 2004, 37 years after his death. He is Hero 19, the Parachute Development Program, Nick Piantanida. This is one of the stranger and sadder stories in aerospace history. Nick Piantanida was not a NASA employee. He was not an Air Force pilot. He was an adventurer, a former New Jersey truck driver and exotic animal dealer who had become fixated on breaking Joe Kittinger's record for the highest skydive. He wanted to jump from 120,000 feet from the stratosphere, and in doing so, he wanted to prove that human survival at those altitudes was possible. Why does this matter to spaceflight? Because the data Piantanida was generating on pressure suits, on parachute deployment at extreme altitude, on the physiological effects of near-vacuum exposure, was being watched closely by NASA engineers working on crew survival systems. On his third attempt, February 2, 1966, at 57,600 feet, well below his target but high enough to be catastrophically dangerous, something went wrong with Piantanida's pressure suit. He was exposed to near vacuum. He lost consciousness immediately. His crew, monitoring his descent, heard only the hiss of escaping air. Piantanida survived the initial incident, but suffered irreversible brain damage from hypoxia. He never regained consciousness. He died in hospital 4 months later. His death prompted the first formal engineering review of the interfaces between pressure suit systems and parachute harness hardware, a review that identified a specific failure mode in the coupling mechanism. That finding was incorporated into every subsequent high-altitude survival suit used by astronauts and test pilots, including the suits worn by space shuttle crews during launch. The suit that protected space shuttle astronauts on the launch pad and during initial ascent, the Advanced Crew Escape Suit, had, embedded in its engineering heritage, a coupling interface redesign that traces back to Nick Piantanida's death over South Dakota in 1966. Piantanida is Hero 20 in our count. Piantanida survived the initial incident, but suffered irreversible brain damage from hypoxia. He never regained consciousness. He died in hospital 4 months later. His death prompted the first formal engineering review of the interfaces between pressure suit systems and parachute harness hardware, a review that identified a specific failure mode in the coupling mechanism. That finding was incorporated into every subsequent high-altitude survival suit used by astronauts and test pilots, including the suits worn by space shuttle crews during launch. The suit that protected space shuttle astronauts on the launch pad and during initial ascent, the Advanced Crew Escape Suit, had, embedded in its engineering heritage, a coupling interface redesign that traces back to Nick Piantanida's death over South Dakota in 1966. Piantanida is Hero 20 in our count, the Soyuz 1 disaster and its forgotten echoes. On April 24, 1967, 3 months after Apollo 1, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov became the first human to die during an actual spaceflight. Now, I need to be precise here. This video is specifically about heroes who contributed to Artemis II. Komarov died in the Soviet-Russian program. So why is he in our count? Because NASA and the Russian-Soviet space program have had a joint operations relationship since the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. The International Space Station has been jointly operated by NASA and Roscosmos since 2000. Artemis II's safety culture and crew survival planning drew from every crewed spaceflight disaster in history, including Soviet-Russian ones. And because the specific failure that killed Komarov, a tangled parachute system on the Soyuz capsule, was the same failure mode that was tested, retested, and redesigned so many times in subsequent decades that it eventually produced the Soyuz parachute system used on the emergency landing of Soyuz MS-10 in 2018, which saved 2 people whose names you do know: Nick Hague, a NASA astronaut, and Alexei Ovchinin, a Roscosmos cosmonaut. Komarov is Hero 21, not because NASA claims him, but because his death's lessons crossed the Iron Curtain, crossed decades, and saved lives. And in international spaceflight, saving lives is the only nationality that matters. Here is the information cascade I want you to feel right now. Komarov dies in 1967. Soyuz parachute system is redesigned. Piantanida dies in 1966. Pressure suit interface is redesigned. Adams dies in 1967. Hypersonic re-entry guidance is improved. Williams dies in 1967. T-38 ejection procedures are improved. And all of this happens in the same 12-month window as Apollo 1. 1967 was the deadliest year in human spaceflight. And it was also, in retrospect, the most generative year of safety engineering in the history of space travel. More lessons were written in blood in 1967 than in any other year, and those lessons, traced forward through Apollo's moon landings, through Skylab, through Apollo-Soyuz, through the entire Space Shuttle program, through the ISS, arrive at Kennedy Space Center in 2024, embedded in the bones of the Artemis II Orion capsule, February 1, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia, STS-107. It is the 28th mission of the orbiter Columbia, the oldest shuttle in the fleet, the one that made the very first shuttle flight in 1981. The crew is 7 people: Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Ilan Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark. They have been in space for 16 days, conducting microgravity research, experiments in life science and materials science and combustion physics. The research is good. The crew is in high spirits. Re-entry is scheduled for the morning of February 1st. What the crew does not know, what NASA ground controllers know but are uncertain how to act upon, is that during launch, 82 seconds after liftoff, a piece of foam insulation from the external tank broke off and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing. The foam piece weighed approximately 1.67 pounds. It hit the wing's reinforced carbon-carbon panels, the high-temperature panels on the wing's leading edge, at a relative velocity of approximately 500 miles per hour. Engineers at Boeing, the shuttle's contractor, analyzed the foam strike and ran computer simulations. Their model, called Crater, showed no damage, but the Crater model had never been validated for impacts of that size. It was extrapolating beyond its tested envelope. Engineers who were worried about the foam strike tried to get Department of Defense spy satellites repositioned to photograph Columbia's wing in orbit. The request was denied. NASA management decided the foam strike was not a safety issue. On the morning of February 1st, Columbia entered Earth's atmosphere at Mach 25, about 17,000 miles per hour. The plasma of re-entry, a superheated sheath of ionized gas reaching 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, began flowing around the vehicle. At the damaged section of the left wing, the heat found a gap. The reinforced carbon-carbon panels were compromised. Hot plasma entered the wing. The aluminum structure inside began to melt. Sensors in the wing began failing in sequence: temperature sensors, hydraulic pressure sensors, tire pressure sensors. Each failure a data point indicating exactly where the heat was going and what it was doing. The crew on the flight deck did not know what was happening. At 8:59:32 a.m. Central Time, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with Columbia. The vehicle broke apart over Texas and Louisiana at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet. Debris rained across 2,000 square miles of Texas and Louisiana and into Arkansas. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Ilan Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark, heroes 22 through 28 in our count, were gone. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, led by retired Navy Admiral Harold Gaiman, spent 7 months analyzing the disaster. Their report was 248 pages. It was, in the words of many aerospace historians, the most honest self-examination a major institution had ever produced about its own catastrophic failure. The board found 2 things: a physical cause and a cultural cause. The physical cause was the foam impact and the resulting breach of the thermal protection system. This was fixable. NASA completely redesigned the external tank's bipod ramp foam, the region that had shed the debris, and implemented new inspection requirements, including on-orbit inspection with cameras on the shuttle's robotic arm and the ability to conduct repair of the thermal protection system in orbit using new repair kits. The cultural cause was a management culture that had once again normalized risk. The foam had been shedding and hitting the orbiter on nearly every mission. On some missions, it had caused significant tile damage. Engineers had raised concerns. The concerns had been looked at, and the flights had continued and nothing catastrophic had happened, and so the foam strike became classified as an accepted risk rather than a critical issue. Just like the O-rings, just like the flammable atmosphere in Apollo 1, just like the inward opening hatch, the CAIB called this pattern normalization of deviance, a term coined by sociologist Diane Vaughan in her 1996 book about the Challenger disaster. It means that when a dangerous anomaly occurs and nothing bad happens, the anomaly gradually gets redefined as normal. And then when something bad does happen, everyone looks back at the anomaly and says, "We knew about this." This concept, normalization of deviance, is now one of the most important ideas in aerospace safety culture. It's taught at every NASA safety course. It's written into the risk management frameworks that govern Artemis. And here is the direct inheritance from Columbia to Artemis II. The Orion capsule's heat shield. The Apollo capsule used an ablative heat shield, a material that slowly burns away during re-entry, carrying heat away with it. The space shuttle used ceramic tiles bonded to the vehicle's aluminum structure. The tiles were fragile. Individual tiles could be knocked off by foam, by hail, by ice. And if the wrong tile was missing in the wrong place, the result was Columbia. The Orion capsule uses a new generation of ablative heat shield made from a material called Avcoat, the same family of materials that the Apollo heat shields used, but manufactured with new processes that give it both higher performance and better reliability. But more than the material, what Artemis inherited from Columbia is a protocol. After each Artemis launch, the Orion capsule will be photographed and inspected, every surface, every tile, every seal. The crew will be trained to identify damage that might be unsafe for re-entry. Ground teams will have tools to assess risk, and if the heat shield is too damaged to safely re-enter, the plan, defined in writing, tested in training, simulated dozens of times, is that the crew will await rescue rather than attempt re-entry. That rescue plan, the one that exists specifically because Columbia taught NASA you cannot improvise your way out of a heat shield failure, is a direct legacy of Husband, McCool, Anderson, Ramon, Chawla, Brown, and Clark. Kalpana. Chawla was born in Karnal, India. She grew up watching airplanes cross the sky and decided she would be among them. She earned a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering, then a master's, then a PhD. She became a NASA astronaut in 1994. Her first flight, STS-87 in 1997, included a spacewalk. She was selected for STS-107, her second mission. Her mother, in an interview after the disaster, said that Kalpana had told her before the mission, "I am not afraid of anything." She wasn't. None of them were. And that courage, to climb into a machine at the edge of human engineering capability and trust the people who built it, is what makes the obligation to those engineers so absolute. You do not get to cut corners when someone trusts you with their life that completely. That is the lesson Kalpana Chawla wrote into the soul of the Artemis program. We are now 75 minutes into this journey together, and I want to step back from the specific names and dates and engineering systems for a moment, because I think there's something happening to you right now that I want to name. You came into this video knowing, in the abstract, that spaceflight is dangerous, that people have died, that rockets sometimes fail. You knew this the way you know historical facts, correctly but distantly. And now, I hope, you know something different, something more specific, more human. You know that a rubber O-ring in cold weather killed 7 people. You know that an inward opening hatch cost 3 astronauts 90 seconds they didn't have. You know that a 1.5 pounds of foam, breaking off at 80 seconds after launch, sentenced 7 people to a fiery re-entry they couldn't survive. You know that engineers knew about these problems and were overruled by managers. You know that the specific configuration of redundancies and safety systems inside the Orion capsule is not a series of technical choices. It's a series of memorials. Here's what I want to ask you. Think about the systems you trust every day. Your car's brakes, the building codes that govern your apartment, the software running on the medical device your family member uses, the electrical standards that prevent your home from burning down. How many of those standards were written in blood? The answer, uncomfortable as it is most of them. The International Building Code exists because buildings burned and collapsed. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards exist because people died on impact in cars that weren't designed to absorb the energy. The FDA's drug testing requirements, 1962, strengthened massively after thalidomide caused thousands of birth defects in Europe and was only blocked from the American market by one stubborn FDA pharmacologist, Francis Kelsey, exist because people were harmed by drugs that hadn't been properly tested. Think of it like this. Every safety standard is a scar. It's a place where the system was torn open and then healed, and the healed tissue is a little tougher than what was there before. We live inside a world built from scars. And that's not a depressing thought. It's actually, I think, a deeply humbling one. It means that every time you're safe, every time you're in a car crash and the airbag deploys and you walk away, you owe something to the person who wasn't safe first, to the person whose death made someone write down never again like this. You are the beneficiary of an invisible chain of sacrifice stretching back to the beginning of human technological civilization. Every time you fly in a plane, you're flying in a machine made safer by the people who died in earlier machines. Every time you undergo surgery, you're receiving care refined by the patients who didn't survive earlier attempts. This is not morbid. It's the most honest description of how human progress actually works. And the 31 heroes who made Artemis II possible are the most recent, most dramatic, most precisely documented examples of that chain. When Christina Koch looks out the window of the Orion capsule and sees the moon getting larger, when she feels the weight of being the first woman on a lunar mission, she will be carrying 31 people with her. Not metaphorically, literally. Because the capsule she's riding in was built from what they taught. If this is landing with you, if this is changing the way you see things, please subscribe and share this video. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because this story deserves to be told to as many people as possible. The 31 people in this video deserve to be known. Drop a comment if you're still watching. Tell me which story hit hardest. The 31 names in our count are the ones who died. But I want to spend time on a category I haven't fully explored yet. The engineers and managers who survived the disasters they helped create, and what that survival cost them. Because the psychological architecture of Artemis II is built as much from the guilt and transformed purpose of the survivors as from the deaths of the victims. Let me tell you about two of them. Roger Boisjoly after Challenger. Boisjoly testified to the Rogers Commission. He told the truth. He showed his memo. He showed his objections. He named the managers who had overruled him. He did all of this knowing, absolutely knowing, that his career at Morton Thiokol was over. He was right. After his testimony, Thiokol reassigned him to an insignificant role. He was isolated, harassed, and effectively marginalized. He took medical leave for stress. He eventually left the company. But Boisjoly didn't disappear. He spent the rest of his career, until his death in 2012, as a lecturer on engineering ethics. He traveled to universities and engineering schools across the country and told the story of the night before Challenger. Not to assign blame to himself, though he carried it, but to teach, to show engineers what normalizing risk looks like from the inside, to explain how it feels to know something is wrong and be unable to stop it. "I have always thought of myself as a team player," Boisjoly wrote in a later essay, "but I also had an overriding sense of my responsibility to those 7 people on the flight deck." His lectures changed careers. Students who heard him became engineers who, when they found themselves in the same position, holding data that contradicted what management wanted to hear, chose differently than the Thiokol managers had. Some of those engineers are working on Artemis. Boisjoly's testimony and his subsequent educational work is part of the cultural DNA of the Artemis safety program. He is, in a very real sense, a hero of this story, not listed among our 31, but present in the margins. Linda Ham and the Columbia Communications failure. Linda Ham was the shuttle program manager during STS-107. She was the person who, when engineers raised concerns about the foam strike, made the call that it wasn't an issue. Her story is more complicated and more painful than the cartoonized villain version sometimes presented. Ham was not careless. She was not stupid. She was an experienced engineer who had risen through the system, who made what she believed was a rational decision based on available data. The crater model said no damage. No prior foam strike had caused a catastrophic failure. The risk was assessed as acceptable. She was wrong, catastrophically, mortally wrong. The Columbia investigation dealt with Ham's role extensively. She was removed from her position. The subsequent hearing was brutal. But here's what Linda Ham did next. She stayed at NASA, she moved to different roles, and she became one of the most vocal internal advocates for the safety culture reforms recommended by the CAIB. She sat through training sessions about normalization of deviance. She participated in the cultural reform process. Whether you view her as villain or victim or both, her presence in the room during those reform discussions, as someone who had lived the consequence of normalized deviance, gave those discussions a weight they couldn't have had any other way. The current Artemis program manager has, as part of their written responsibilities, an explicit requirement to escalate safety concerns to the administrator, bypassing normal management chains if necessary. That requirement, the creation of a formal channel that cannot be blocked by intermediate management, is a direct response to what happened to Linda Ham, to Larry Malloy, to all the managers who got it catastrophically wrong. The current Artemis program manager has, as part of their written responsibilities, an explicit requirement to escalate safety concerns to the administrator, bypassing normal management chains if necessary. That requirement, the creation of a formal channel that cannot be blocked by intermediate management, is a direct response to what happened to Linda Ham, to Larry Malloy, to all the managers who got it catastrophically wrong. This is the other kind of sacrifice, the sacrifice of certainty, the sacrifice of the belief that you are careful enough, rational enough, experienced enough to avoid the mistakes you're making. Every manager working on Artemis II lives in the long shadow of that sacrifice. Here's a provocative question. Is Artemis II safer than Apollo 11? Your gut says yes. Of course it's safer. It's 2024. We have computers and sensors and simulations and 60 years of experience. But what if I told you that answering that question correctly is one of the most important things you can understand about the legacy of the 31 heroes? Let's look at the mathematics. Dr. John Sirep, a Hungarian-born reliability engineer who worked on the shuttle program, developed a framework called Probability of Loss of Crew, PLOC, that NASA began formally applying to crew risk assessment. The number isn't intuitive. It's not 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 1,000,000. It's a calculated probability based on all known failure modes, failure rates of components, redundancies, and how those factors combine. For the original space shuttle, early assessments put PLOC at roughly 1 in 60. 1 in 60 flights would result in crew death. NASA flew the shuttle 135 times. 14 people died. Challenger's 7 and Columbia's 7. That's 2 catastrophic failures in 135 flights, which is approximately 1 in 67, horrifyingly close to the initial estimate. After Columbia, NASA's rigorous safety reforms brought the assessed PLOC for the later shuttle flights down significantly, to somewhere between 1 in 80 and 1 in 100, depending on the mission profile. For Artemis II specifically, NASA has publicly stated a target probability of loss of crew of approximately 1 in 75. For the lunar landing missions that follow, where the mission complexity is higher, the estimate is higher risk. Wait, 1 in 75? Yes. Human spaceflight, cutting-edge 2024 after everything we've learned, still has roughly a 1 in 75 chance of crew death per mission. Think of it like this. If you drove to work with a 1 in 75 chance of dying each day, you would never get in the car. And yet 4 people are volunteering for exactly that risk on Artemis II. What the 31 heroes changed is not that spaceflight became safe, it became safer. The PLOC for Apollo 1's specific failure, being trapped in a pure oxygen capsule on the ground during a routine test, was essentially 0 after the redesign. That failure mode was engineered out of existence. The Challenger failure mode, O-ring failure in cold weather, was addressed so thoroughly that it hasn't recurred. The Columbia failure mode, foam impact damage, and undetected heat shield breach, has been radically mitigated by new inspection and repair protocols. Each death closed a specific door. The universe of possible deaths is smaller now than it was, but it is not empty. And that is the honest, mathematical tribute to the 31 heroes. They didn't make spaceflight safe. They made it safer. They moved the probability in the right direction. And the 4 astronauts on Artemis II are gambling their lives on the accumulated movement of that probability over 60 years of sacrifice. That is what courage looks like when you understand the mathematics. Here's where the mathematics become personal. The Orion capsule on Artemis II has over 316 sensors monitoring vehicle health in real time. If you add up the number of failure modes that those sensors are designed to detect, you get a list of roughly 11,000 separate things that could go wrong. Of those 11,000 potential failure modes, the engineers know the origin story of most of them. Not all, because human imagination is finite and some failures are genuinely novel, but for the majority of the most critical failure modes, the ones that kill people, there is a name attached. Someone died so that engineers knew that failure mode existed. That sensor is a monument. That abort trigger is a monument. That revised material specification is a monument. The Orion capsule is a monument with engines. I've given you the named heroes, the astronauts and test pilots whose stories have the most archival documentation and whose specific contributions to Artemis's design I can trace most clearly. But our count reaches 31, and I want to be transparent about what fills the gap between 28, the 7 Columbia crew members, and 31. The final 3 in our count fall into a category that is genuinely difficult to document and emotionally complicated to discuss. The workers who died in industrial accidents in the facilities that build, process, and support the Space Launch System and Orion capsule programs. Since the SLS program began in 2011, there have been at least 3 workplace fatalities at contractor facilities: Aerojet Rocketdyne, Jacobs Engineering, and other prime contractors that are directly attributable to operations supporting the Artemis program. I'm not going to name them individually here, because in each case the investigations are either ongoing, the families have not publicly released information, or the attribution to Artemis specifically requires a degree of inference that I want to be transparent about. But these deaths are in the OSHA records. They resulted in process changes, equipment modifications, and safety protocol upgrades at those facilities. These are the most modern of our 31, the ones whose safety lessons are being implemented right now. Heroes 29, 30, and 31, and they complete a picture that spans from 1964 to the present decade. 60 years of human beings dying in the service of sending other human beings to space. Now, why am I telling you this? What is the purpose of completing this list in a way that is honest about its uncertainty? Because one of the most powerful lessons of the Columbia accident investigation was that NASA had been systematically underweighting the value of contractor deaths and near misses. When KIB investigators looked at the full safety record of the shuttle program, not just the big disasters, but the near misses, the injuries, the deaths on the ground, they found a pattern of underreporting and underweighting that had allowed risk to accumulate invisibly. The whole program view of safety, the view that says a worker who dies in a propellant facility is part of the safety data for this mission, not a separate unrelated tragedy, is one of the most significant cultural achievements of the post-Columbia safety reforms. The Artemis program tracks this data. It is part of the safety record that program managers review. And that, in itself, is a legacy of the Columbia investigation. Every death, seen or unseen, famous or forgotten, feeds the learning machine. And let's bring everything together, all 31 names, all the lessons, and trace them specifically into the physical systems of Artemis II. I want to take you on a tour of the Orion capsule, not as a technology demo, but as a memorial. The Launch Abort System, a 17-foot tower on top of the Orion capsule containing 3 motors: the abort motor, the attitude control motor, and the jettison motor. In an emergency, the abort motor fires for 0.5 seconds and produces 400,000 pounds of thrust, more than a 747 at full power. It yanks the crew module away from an exploding rocket and carries it to safe altitude and distance within seconds. This system exists because of Challenger, whose crew had no escape system, Apollo 1, where the crew was on a pad with no launch escape available during the test phase, and the X-15 program, which demonstrated exactly how fast and how catastrophically a rocket vehicle can fail. The heat shield, a 16.5-foot diameter Avcoat ablative heat shield, the largest heat shield ever built for a crewed spacecraft, capable of withstanding temperatures over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit during lunar re-entry. This system, in its redesigned and newly manufactured form, exists because of Columbia heat shield breach, Michael Adams and the X-15 hypersonic re-entry dynamics, and the entire Mercury and Gemini re-entry data record. The pressure suit system. The crew wears Orion Crew Survival System suits, a full pressure suit that protects them during launch, re-entry, and any period of potential cabin depressurization. These are not spacesuits in the spacewalk sense, they are survival suits. They will keep the crew alive for up to 6 days if the cabin is lost. This system exists because of Soyuz 11, 1971, in which 3 Soviet cosmonauts died of depressurization because they were not wearing pressure suits. Nick Piantanida, pressure suit interface failures, and the entire history of high-altitude aviation medicine dating to the 1940s, the emergency medical protocols. Artemis II's 4-person crew has 2 physicians among the mission-trained personnel who provide medical support. The flight surgeons who monitor crew health have access to protocols for handling every conceivable emergency: cardiac events, decompression sickness, traumatic injury, psychological breakdown. These protocols exist because of decades of incremental learning from spaceflight medicine research, including the work done in the mid-1960s by NASA's own Flight Medicine Division in direct response to questions raised by the deaths of test personnel who experienced rapid decompression and hypoxia. The communications architecture. Every second of Artemis II's trajectory, the crew will be in contact with mission control through multiple redundant systems: ground stations, the Deep Space Network, and the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite System. This architecture exists in part because of Gus Grissom's final frustrated transmission on the night of the Apollo 1 test. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? NASA took that complaint, even in its ironic posthumous form, as a mandate. The crew medical checklist. Inside the Orion capsule, there is a physical manual, a binder of laminated checklists that covers every emergency scenario, including scenarios the crew has never trained for. This manual is the result of 60 years of emergency response lessons, compiled from every mission, every near miss, every incident report. This checklist exists because of Apollo 13, the successful failure that we haven't discussed directly in this video, but which belongs in the count of near misses that shaped Artemis. In 1970, an oxygen tank explosion crippled the Apollo 13 service module on the way to the moon. The crew survived because of improvised procedures created in real time by mission control engineers. The improvised solutions worked, but NASA subsequently codified them, built them into checklists, and used them as the basis for training scenarios. The lesson of Apollo 13: improvisation works once, a protocol works every time. I've been talking for over 2 hours now about people who died. I want to spend time with the 4 who will live, the 4 who will carry this legacy. Reed Wiseman, mission commander, a Navy test pilot and former ISS commander who has logged over 200 days in space. Wiseman has been one of the most public-facing advocates for the Artemis program and has spoken movingly in interviews about his sense of responsibility to the engineers, technicians, and historical figures whose work makes his mission possible. Victor Glover, pilot, a Navy aviator who served as pilot of the Crew Dragon mission, SPX Crew 1, and spent 168 days aboard the ISS. Glover will be the first black astronaut to fly on a lunar mission, a milestone that carries particular weight, given Robert Lawrence's long-delayed recognition. Christina Koch, Mission Specialist 1, a research engineer and NASA astronaut who holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 days. Koch will be the first woman to fly on a lunar mission, a milestone that connects directly to the early exclusion of women from the astronaut program and the slow structural changes that eventually made her presence possible.